There is a famous story by the American author Mark Twain called The Prince and the Pauper. In this story, a prince invites a poor beggar into his castle, and for fun, the two exchange clothes. As the story goes, the beggar, being mistaken for the prince, is kept in the castle and lives the life of a prince. But the prince is mistaken for the beggar and is thrown out of the castle. Now, had the prince known that he would be thrown out of the castle, I'm sure he never would have agreed to change clothes with the beggar. Dabbling in such simple fun could never be worth losing so much. In some ways, the situation in the city of Colossae during the first century resembled the story of the prince and the pauper. The Christians in Colossae were being tempted to exchange their great privileges in Christ for the practice of pagan forms of worship. So Paul wrote an epistle to remind the Colossians of the tremendous riches and royal privileges they enjoyed in Christ, the King over all. And he warned them of the serious consequences of trading these blessings for the meager benefits that idolatry pretended to offer.
Besides employing Greek philosophy and adopting corrupt practices based on Jewish law, the false teachers caused problems in Colossae by promoting the worship of spiritual beings and encouraging Christians to venerate and appease these powers. We see evidence that the Colossian church was courting the worship of spiritual beings in at least three ways. First, Paul wrote about the worship of angels. Second, he addressed the matter of rulers and authorities. And third, he dealt with problems related to the basic principles of this world. We should begin by looking at his mention of angel worship. According to the Bible, angels are God's servants, and they have always played important roles in God's plan for His creation. God delegates many jobs to them, from spiritual warfare to influencing national politics to delivering messages to His people, to caring for the earthly needs of believers. But according to the false teachers in Colossae, angels were much more than ministers. They were cosmic powers, oracles that revealed mysterious teachings to those who would perform their cultic rites and worship them. The false teachers claimed to have received visions from angels, and on this basis, they insisted that Christians should complete the proper rituals so that they might receive similar visions. We cannot know for sure, but it's possible that the false teachers really had experienced visions, though these would have been from demons rather than from God's holy angels. At the same time, they may have experienced self-induced or even drug-induced ecstatic trances, or they might simply have been lying. Whatever the case, this exaggerated view of the power and influence of angels was not uncommon in the ancient world. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that some Jewish teachers maintained similar ideas about angels, and some Greek philosophies taught similar things about their oracles and astral powers. Sadly, the familiarity of these ideas to the Colossian Christians probably made the false teachings sound reasonable, allowing them to gain a foothold in the Colossian church.
When the Colossians heard about angels and spiritual beings, it sounded very reasonable to them because it was very similar to their Greek belief system, their worship of gods, that is deeply rooted in their culture. So when you find somebody having to say something to you that is similar to your upbringing that you grew up with, then you have a point of affiliation, then you have a point of connection. But the danger in that is, if I use something you're familiar with just to connect with you, it may be used wrongly because it's not established on truth. And that's why Paul had to be clear by exalting Christ above all authorities, above all spiritual dominion, that it is through Christ all things are made, and unto Him we have to connect and establish our being.
Now that we've looked at Paul's direct references to the worship of angels, we should turn to his discussion of rulers and authorities. In the language of the first century, the terms rulers and authorities referred to spiritual beings such as angels or even demons. As we've just seen, the false teachers in Colossae encouraged believers to worship angels and other spiritual beings. But Paul responded to this heresy by emphasizing Christ's superiority over every power and authority in heaven and on earth. He wrote of Jesus' supremacy in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Here Paul mentioned thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities. Thrones and dominions translate forms of the Greek words thronos and kuriates. Both words commonly refer to human kings and other earthly rulers, but they could also refer to spiritual beings. Rulers and authorities, in turn, translate forms of the Greek words arche and exousia, words that usually refer to invisible spiritual powers such as angels and demons. In the outlooks of the false teachers in Colossae, the angelic and demonic spiritual authorities were significantly greater than their earthly human counterparts. The false teachers greatly exaggerated the power of angels and demons, so much so that they attributed to these invisible rulers actions and abilities that in reality belong to Christ alone. Paul pointed out their error by praising Christ as the Lord, who had created all things. Rather than distinguishing between the spiritual and earthly authorities, Paul treated them as one, indicating that the spiritual and the earthly were far more similar than they were different. They were both created and both were inferior to Christ. The real contrast to be drawn was not of the spiritual over the earthly, as the false teachers insisted, but of Christ over all. Paul indicated that regardless of how the false teachers envisioned the spiritual beings they worshipped, the truth was that only evil spirits or demons allow themselves to be worshipped. God's holy angels have no part in such idolatry, and Christ does not permit the worship of his enemies. Paul addressed this point in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, where he wrote, He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. Through the cross of Jesus Christ, God disarmed and triumphed over the spiritual powers and authorities.
Our life is lived in the context of actually a cosmic battle between God and all that stands in opposition to God, the powers and principalities, the authorities, the forces of evil, the forces of darkness in this world. That notion is carried through not only the Old Testament, but really comes to full fruition in the New Testament when Jesus comes to earth. And Jesus is, in a surprising way, a consummate warrior because he doesn't do battle with, say, the Romans who are occupying the land of Judah, but in fact, Jesus is defeating who our real enemies are, Satan and sin and the power of sin and its ultimate consequence, death. And so you see the New Testament talking about that cosmic battle coming into focus when Jesus conquers all of the power of sin and death, conquers Satan himself through his death and resurrection.
The spiritual powers and authorities opposed God in spiritual war. They were rebellious, evil spirits, enemies of God. They were demons, not holy angels. But through Jesus Christ, God stripped these demons of their ability to fight and humiliated them in defeat. These fallen, powerless, defeated demons were the spiritual powers worshipped by the false teachers in Colossae, the ones that Paul referred to as rulers and authorities. Now that we've explored Paul's mention of angels and spiritual rulers and authorities, we're in a position to see how Paul spoke of the basic principles of this world. In the first century, the Greek term stoicheia, which may be translated basic principles, commonly referred to the gods and spiritual powers that were associated with the stars and planets. Stoicheia was also used to refer to the four basic physical elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. These basic principles or elements were thought to influence and even control the fates of men and women. This same meaning of stoicheia is also the one Paul intended in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, where he condemned these basic principles. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. Paul pointed to the elemental spirits, or stoicheia, as the basis for the philosophy of the false teachers. In other words, he was arguing that the religious traditions of the false teachers should be rejected because they appealed to false gods.
False teachers were trying to persuade the Colossian church to worship cosmic spiritual powers, and they were encouraging an ascetic lifestyle, thinking that such harsh living would placate the spiritual powers and reap some benefit from these false gods. So Paul began to refute these false teachings by contrasting these pathetic impostor gods with Jesus Christ. Paul insisted that Christ is the King of all creation and that he possesses all perfections and authority. And more than this, Paul taught that the basic principles of the world are incapable of delivering the blessings of salvation and are unworthy of reverence.
In Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, Paul touched on at least 6 important facets of the supremacy of Christ. Most of these details stood in stark contrast with the false teachings in Colossae. First, Paul began by saying that Christ is the image of the invisible God. Listen to how Paul described Jesus in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. All things were created through him and for him. Although the Scriptures speak many times of all human beings as the image of God, here Paul had in mind something that was unique to Jesus. Whereas the false teachers looked to the planets and elements as the image or revelation of God, Paul pointed to Christ as the image of God. He adopted this Greek philosophical term, image of God, in this way in order to show that Christ, and not the demons worshipped by the false teachers, was the ultimate revelation of God. Second, Paul described Christ as the firstborn of all creation. The Greek term prototokos, here translated firstborn, often referred to superiority and authority rather than to order of birth.
When Paul said that Christ was the firstborn over all of creation, he meant that Christ was the one who possessed the authority of the Father, not that Christ was born or created before other creatures. He did not mean that Christ was part of creation, but that Christ was Lord over creation. He emphasized this to make it clear that the false gods of the false teachers in Colossae had no power or authority to give any blessings to anyone. Christ and Christ alone was the firstborn, the one who inherited all the blessings of God, and he alone could give God's blessings to others.
Third, Paul also said that Christ was the agent of creation, the one through whom God created the universe. Jewish mysticism often attributed prominent roles to angels in creation, roles that the Bible ascribes to God and to Christ, but not to angels. And in Greek philosophy, the elements and other astral powers were commonly assigned similar roles. But Paul insisted that Christ is the only agent of creation. He is the creator, and all of these other powers are inferior to him and subject to him. Fourth, Paul also insisted that Christ is the supreme Lord because God placed him as head over the church. Listen to Paul's words in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. Paul explained that in addition to being the creator, Christ is also the head of the body, the church, and the firstborn from among the dead. In other words, he is Lord over the new humanity, the church, and over all those who have been raised with Christ to new life. Christ is the head over the old creation and the new creation, so that in everything he might have supremacy. Contrary to the false teachers who had begun to influence the church in Colossae, any teaching that detracts from Christ's supreme lordship and glorious sovereignty over all is false. Fifth, Paul explained that Christ is God incarnate. This remarkable statement surpasses any claim made about the so-called rulers and authorities of Greek paganism and Jewish mysticism. Listen to Paul's words in Colossians chapter 1, verse 19. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. As Paul made clear here, although Christ is incarnate, truly a man, all the fullness of God dwells in him, making Christ the incarnation of the supreme God. Finally, Paul exalted Christ by speaking of him as the only reconciler between God and the fallen, sinful world. Paul explained this fact about Christ in Colossians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. God was pleased through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. God's plan through Jesus is to reconcile to himself all things. That is, Jesus Christ is the one who brings peace between God and his fallen creation by the blood of his cross. As a result, when Christ returns in glory, he will extend this peace to all things, whether on earth or in heaven. From Paul's point of view, the false teachers in Colossae called for the worship of feeble powers. For the Colossians to submit to this teaching was to diminish, even steal, the glory and authority that belonged only to Christ. In the end, Paul mocked the false teachers and warned that they were leading the Colossian Christians away from Christ. The gospel, or good news, that Paul preached was that God was restoring all of creation to a sinless, pristine, and eternally blessed condition. And he was doing this through Jesus Christ, and only through Jesus Christ. Through Jesus alone, sins could be forgiven and God's favor gained. There was no need to bother with the petty and powerless spirits of the false teachers. Access to God and his spiritual blessings was only available in Jesus. From the first century Roman perspective, it was only wise to worship many gods. But Christ demanded exclusive loyalty and worship. When men and women served Christ, they could not worship anything else. This is why Paul insisted that the Colossians remain steadfast in their exclusive commitment to Christ.
The truth is that our circumstances today are not that different from the circumstances in Colossae in the first century. In one way or another, it's likely that we feel pressure to compromise our exclusive loyalty to Christ. These may be pressures to accept the validity of other religions and gods, or to mix the teachings of these other faiths with our Christian faith. These pressures may come from our government, from universities and schools, from our neighbors and friends, from our families, or at times even from our church leaders. But Paul's letter to the Colossians makes it clear that genuine Christian faith, the faith that Jesus proclaimed and Paul taught, requires us to stand strong in our exclusive devotion to Christ. Even when the world threatens us with harm, we are to insist that only Christ is worthy of worship and only He offers eternal salvation. We must remain steadfast in our loyalty to Christ alone.